Hi, Tony Moss here again. I'm with Dr. Ray Ciervo, and this is the No Pat Answers podcast. Now, if you're watching us today, this is pre-recorded, so there'll be somewhere during the broadcast, there'll be an email where you can send your questions in, and it's very simple, questions@nopatanswers.com. So this is about the fifth time I think we've been doing this, and we kind of gave you an overview of what Ray's ministry is, and then we started looking at the central ideas that Christians need to master to effectively communicate their faith. In the world we live in, there's so many people who are so skeptical about the Christian faith, and so we looked at truth, we looked at the existence of God, and then last week and now today we're looking at the idea of the resurrection of Jesus.
Right.
So last time we looked at the skeptics saying that Jesus didn't exist, and the myths that people say that are held forth and that the Christian writers supposedly stole from, and we looked at how that really didn't hold much water.
Right.
And so today we want to get into what is a very key thing, and that's the eyewitness accounts. So when we look at the Gospels and the Book of Acts, what we're looking at is eyewitnesses telling us this is what happened at this point in history. And so the question, of course, for today is the eyewitness testimony of the Gospels and the Book of Acts, is this credible to us? And even the writers of the epistles, how credible is that? So where do we start with that? Just the idea of what makes eyewitness testimony credible, right?
Yeah, there are a number of factors that we would look at for credibility. And if you boil them down, it would be how early is the testimony
from when the
actual accounts happen. So if we just have a benchmark and say Jesus rose from the dead in AD 30, how close do we have eyewitness testimony writing things down? I mean, obviously we see in the Book of Acts and in the Gospels themselves that the disciples were affected by the resurrection, their lives were changed, and then we see the emergence of the church in the Book of Acts. So we know that those things happen right in time with the resurrection. So how early was something written down?
Okay.
Because what we do have is what we would call an oral community or culture. And mainly they are communicating most things orally. And they don't, I won't say that they didn't recognize writing as credible as oral testimony, but you have to understand that most of the things that were communicated, other than the epistles, probably started with oral testimony, not including the Book of Acts. So how early it is, and then do we have multiple sources?
Okay.
Do we have other outside sources outside of the New Testament and the Gospels conveying the same message, or at least mirroring the same message?
And within the Gospels, multiple writers accounting for the same events.
Yeah, well, you have 4 Gospels, and each of them gives a different perspective or records different things. Some of them, like what we call the synoptics, all basically have very similar messages with some differences, Mark being the shortest, Luke being the longest, and Matthew in between that, but even their styles of writing and recording are different. And then you have the Gospel of John, which is written many years later and only really has some of the things that the synoptics have, but a lot of different things also. So multiple sources within the Gospels. Then you have Christian writers of the first and early second century that basically were saying the same thing. They're quoting the gospel writers. They're quoting the very things there. And then perhaps the most strong, I think, is one of the strongest is the non-Christian writers that are commenting on the early church and on the beliefs of the early church. So those two things are very strong. And the third one is a little bit of a strange thing. They call it dissimilarity. And I'm not sure who decided that this only applies to Jesus. But dissimilarity means that when Jesus says something that isn't echoing something Jewish writers at the same time would have said, that makes it authentic. Why that makes it
Yeah.
authentic, I don't know. I mean, I would think if Jesus was alive in the first century and he listened to other Jewish writers, why wouldn't speakers or rabbis, why wouldn't he say some of the same things? It's not like he had this completely new message. He's responding to the Old Testament law and prophets. So those three things are what a lot of historians use to look at whether the Gospels are credible. But we outline this a little bit differently.
Okay, now today you'll hear people say something about, oh, well, whether it's all the different shows that we have from, investigating cold cases, murders and things like that,
Right.
as well as dramas. They'll always talk about how reliable a witness is. And that, if five people see the same thing, it seems like five different accounts.
Right.
And so that seems to undermine the credibility of eyewitness testimony in general.
Yeah, and the reverse is actually true. In that
That's interesting.
You want people to say things different. You don't want them to all parrot the same thing and say everything exactly the same. Because everybody has different perspectives. One of the glaring ones that I know I've used in the past was when the Titanic sunk. There were, I think, 1,200 survivors when the Titanic sunk, and some of them thought that the Titanic broke in half before it sank, and the other half, or however many, thought it went down as one piece. So here you have people right there on the scene, and that's kind of huge.
Yeah.
But they remember it or saw it differently. So
But the Titanic did sink.
it still sank, yeah, it still sank, definitely. But, Richard Bauckham, Dr. Richard Bauckham wrote a book a couple of years ago called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It's just been gone through its second edition, basically. They've just added, I think he told me that they added another 40,000 words. He added 3 more chapters onto the end of the book. But it's become the landmark called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He's done such incredible research, and there's a wealth of information in the book. And he said that trusting testimony is not an irrational act of faith that leaves critical rationality aside. It is, on the contrary, the rationally appropriate way of responding to authentic testimony. Then he says, Gospels, understood as testimony, are the entirely appropriate means of access to the historical reality of Jesus. So it tells us there that testimony is in a very important part, and it's not irrational to believe testimony. And what we have in the Gospels is we have 4 testimonies right there of the historical Jesus and the resurrection. And this quote I love. He says, it is also a rather neglected fact that all history, like all knowledge, relies on testimony. So that's kind of like, duh. Why doesn't anybody realize this, that everything that we have as history is basically relying on testimony?
Like you said of the Titanic, or, if you hear a reporter who's on the scene of something now, even though we have cameras there now and that sort of thing, we're still listening to their assessment of it.
Right.
Because we're not there live.
Right.
And we don't say, well, how does he know?
Yeah.
Why would we believe him?
Yeah. And Bauckham, my first copy of his book, I think I started to just highlight it in places that I thought were really strong testimony for testimony, and I found that myself just highlighting the whole chapter of the, But he tells us that testimony offers us both a reputable historiographical category for reading the Gospels as history, and also a theological model for understanding the Gospels as an entirely appropriate means of access to the historical reality of Jesus. And he says there, goes on to say that when you stop seeing the historical aspect of Jesus, you lose the theology.
Okay.
And so now, if you do that, then you have to impose some kind of theology on there, because you're not reading it as fact, and you're not letting the Gospels really be a revelation to us of what God has done. So that's one of the important things.
So the question could be, so were the writers of the Gospels eyewitnesses? Of course, somewhat rhetorical, because we're saying yes, they were.
Right.
And where do we look at that? What do we see that?
Well,
What are the kind of things we find that
Right.
help us see that?
Well, we know that Mark's gospel was more than likely Peter's gospel. It was Peter's notes. It's what one of the papists, one of the early church fathers, tells us, that Mark's gospel were really, Mark was Peter's secretary, and so he tells us, Papias tells us in his writings that Mark basically remembered or copied down the things that Peter said, and that's where we get Mark's gospel. And we know that Luke was a companion of Paul, but Luke tells us in his first chapter, verses 1 through 4, really, that he interviewed everybody who was there from the beginning. He says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught." So he tells us that, first of all, there's already been some other people have compiled an account. Well, who could he be talking about there? He could be talking about Mark, and he could be talking about Matthew. And maybe there were other things written that didn't survive. But they were things that were handed down to them who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. So these people were eyewitnesses. They recorded these things, and now he's taken up the task to do it in an orderly fashion. Because when you read Mark's gospel, you realize it's not orderly. It's not in chronological order, where Luke basically
Says he's going to do that.
right.
Yes.
This is what he's going to do. So it's an important part. So we know Luke wasn't an eyewitness, but he interviewed eyewitnesses. So he's telling us that these are eyewitness accounts. And again, you have the other two synoptics, Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel, that corroborate Luke's gospel, if you want to look at it that way. And if today, the argument for years was, well, which was written first? Was it Mark or Matthew? And the leaning today among scholars tend to go toward Mark. I'm up in the air over it. I've always thought Matthew was the first gospel. I'm not that kind of New Testament scholar that I can really argue the point, but it just seems like the things I've read pointed to that. So, and it really doesn't matter. One of them was written before the other one. And this is
It's true.
This is what Luke is.
They were early, though.
Right. We'll see that they were very early.
Okay. What would you expect to find in, accurate? Like if I went and interviewed somebody who had witnessed an event that happened, what would and I was going to write about it? What would I be putting in, or what would they be putting in that would help make it stronger?
Yeah, you would expect that the New Testament writers, if they were eyewitnesses, they would understand all the surrounding tidbits of any event that happens. And the list that we make is, they would know the political conditions. You read about the Roman authorities and the Jewish rulers, which should stand out because even Roman historians had a hard time understanding the transition of the Jewish rulers during the first 40 or 50 years of the first century, from when Herod the Great takes the throne in, I believe it's 4 or 6 BC, and then reigns for quite a long time. And then his successors, there's like 5 different changes among just the Herods in the different areas of Palestine. And yet the New Testament writers write about that just kind of like offhand, that this was happening here and that's happening there. And as I mentioned, that even the Roman writers, Tacitus, who's supposed to be the best Roman historian, he had a hard time understanding those things. But the New Testament writers don't even wince at it. They just go ahead and tell us that.
Put it down what they saw happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and you see the condition of the Jews. You see the state that they're in at the time. You can see the interaction between the different parties of the Jewish community, and as well as the Greco-Roman world. All of those things are just part of it. One of the things that people try to include when you come up to Easter or Christmas or any big holiday, they start talking about what we call the Gnostic Gospels, who have a totally different flavor of the person of Jesus. However, they never mention anything of the culture of first century Judaism. They don't have anything there because they were written in the second century.
Yeah.
And we're talking about after AD 70, Jewish culture doesn't exist anymore.
Right, after the destroying of...
So, I think it's a very strong argument to make that the Gospels, especially the Synoptics, were written before AD 70. The historians tell us that, and again, we'll look at it, that John was probably written later. Some people say no to that, but that's up for grabs. So those are the kinds of things that you would see or expect to see there.
So early testimony is important. What other factors would you cover?
I would cover things. Bauckham brings this up. I call it the names of testimony, and we'll look at that. So early testimony, names of testimony, embarrassing testimony. Even the historians say that when you're writing a biography that you're included in, that you never write embarrassing things about yourself.
Yeah.
But the New Testament writers do include the disciples were chastised for not having faith. They're chastised for the things that you wouldn't want other people to know. For instance, when Jesus is crucified, they all disappear, and it's women who are there at the tomb, and it's women who Jesus appears to first, and they have to go and tell the disciples. And when they tell the disciples don't believe them. They think, so that's what you call embarrassing testimony. And the last one is, again, I think it's one of the strongest ones, is what we call corroborating testimony, that we have outside sources that tell us these things.
Okay, well, we don't have, hopefully we'll get through all of this. So let's look at each of these things. What evidence do we have about early testimony?
Well, the early testimony we would look at actually isn't one in the Gospels. It's 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul wrote. And if we did a quick timeline and say that Paul's first visit to Corinth was in 49 AD, and most people put his writing of 1 Corinthians either 54 or 55, so it's several years later. Again, in my mind, I think that's a long time in between him being there. He was there for 18 months, gets there in 49, and leaves probably within 2 years. He's there 18 months. And then writes, 3 years later, which to me in my mind doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'll agree with it. He writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." And you can construct a timeline where these things are really part of the gospel story. You can see that they're part of the resurrection. And, critics will say, well, why would Paul say he delivered to them something that he received? Because Paul had his own revelation of Jesus. So what is he talking about? Well, there are markers in here. If we had the time, we could really spend just on this portion of Scripture from verses 3 through 8 in 1 Corinthians that really tell us that this is a translation from Aramaic. So this was when the church was still, it hadn't become Hellenized yet, hadn't gone over to the Greek understanding of things. This is coming from Jerusalem. And when did Paul receive this? Well, if Jesus was raised in AD 30, Paul is there he's converted within 2 years. And then he goes back to Jerusalem in 3 years after that. So when did he get this? I think it was probably the first time that he is in contact with the church, because this is in accordance. It's in the style of how the Jews would have transmitted something orally to another. They would remember this, and we don't hear it in English so much, but it's a metered thing. Some of the phraseology, from what I understand in Aramaic, tells us that this is something that is recorded that way or remembered that way, memorized. That's the word I'm looking for. The fact that he calls Peter Cephas, uses his Aramaic name, and it's an important part. So within, I would say, if you gave it the longest possible time, within 5 years, Paul receives this. So when was this memorized, or when was it transmitted? Well, if you go to the book of Acts, it tells you that the church was sitting at the apostles' feet. So it could have been very easily, right from the beginning, this was there. And I would tend to think this wasn't something they thought up later to teach people. This was the way that they would teach them how this was there. So Paul's writing this 1 Corinthians is 55, but he's there in 49. And this is when the church would have received this, but Paul would have received it much earlier. And when I teach this, I have basically a creedal confirmation where Paul gets this, and you can see the timeline of when all this takes place. So it's somewhere within the first 4 or 5 years that he's received this.
All right, so we know it's early. I know the information you've given me. There's a lot of that. You look at a chain of evidence. I guess this is this chain of evidence that you have. Is this just following through the affirmations of it?
Yeah, the chain of evidence is that, and it's Saint Augustine who uses that phrase, I think, first. The chain of evidence. If you just pick the 4 people that I use as Papias, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement of Rome, they're all alive in the late 1st century, would be the earliest, and the early 2nd century. So they're the what we call it the apostolic fathers. Papias is a very unique person in that he would always wait to find somebody who had actually either been with the apostles or been at the resurrection, or seen Jesus raised from the dead. So, and there would have still been people who were alive even at the end of the 1st century that could have seen Jesus alive if they were young and they lived long. But they all, Papias, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement of Rome, they all mention that they're quoting the New Testament, they're quoting the Gospels, they're quoting the words of Jesus and other ones, and we understand that that they, again, either orally or they're writing it down, but they're confirming that the Gospels were previous to them. Some people try to say that the Gospels weren't written for another 100 years or so. Yeah. They're made up.
Then how do we have historical evidence that they're referring back to?
Right. Very.
It's very good. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're an eyewitness, you know things about things that no one else knows. Like, I'll get to this other one in a minute, but I remember when the Dodgers left Brooklyn, and they hung an effigy of Walt O'Malley
in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn, several places, and burned it.
Yeah.
Over a light post.
Yeah.
Well, if you weren't there, you wouldn't remember those things. You wouldn't know those things.
I knew the Dodgers left Brooklyn, and people were upset about it.
Oh, it was traumatic.
Yeah.
It was a traumatic experience when they actually left, because everybody was hoping they would stay. Well, the point is, unless you were there, you wouldn't know those things about it. But there you go. So you have those understandings.
All right, so now to move along, you have early testimony, and there's a wealth of evidence to affirm that the testimony of Jesus being raised from the dead was recorded early on,
right,
and by multiple people. So now, what do you mean by names of testimony?
Yeah, this is another thing that I think is so interesting that Bauckham reports on. He didn't do this search or study, but there was a study done where in Jerusalem, when they uncover a grave or a sepulcher, they find these stone boxes, right? They're called ossuaries. And on the stone box, they'll have names written, and basically they're bone boxes. So the way that the Jews buried somebody is that they would mummify them for a year until all the flesh decays off of them. Then they would go into the grave, into the tomb, get all the bones, put it in this box, and that's what they would keep in that grave. So if you were buried with your fathers, basically what they mean by that is that your bones would be on a shelf in that tomb next to your fathers. Well, what they started to do, the study was they started to look at the names on these ossuaries from the 1st century and match them to the book of Acts and to the Gospels. And what do we find? That in the Gospel and Acts, the number one name that's there is Simon. 10.3% is Simon. On the ossuaries, it's 13%. Joseph is the second name, again, matches the ossuaries. It's 7.7 and 10.2, respectively, Gospel and Acts, and then the ossuaries. The third one is Judas. Again, first top 3 names all match. So we're looking at the names in the New Testament, and we know that they're matching exactly that way. And that there's an interesting fact that comes up with this. I just list 5 of them when I do this. The first one that goes off is John, number 4. It's in the Gospel and Acts, and Lazarus on the ossuaries, and then James and John, number 5. But it's interesting that when the Gospels address Peter, they call him Simon Peter because there's another Simon. And when they address Judas, they call Judas Iscariot. And so you have names that are all different. James is another one. When James is named, you have James the Less, James the son of Zebedee. So they're distinguishing this James from that James. And it's interesting that it's only in the top 8 or 9 names or so that they make that distinction, because once they want you to make sure that you're not mistaking John the Baptist for John the Beloved. When they're talking about John the Baptist being beheaded, they just don't want to say they beheaded John, because people think, and why do they do that? Well, again, go back to my childhood. Had a family. My grandfather's name was Salvatore. Salvatore. Salvador is Spanish, Salvatore is Italian. And I had several cousins named Sal. So
how do you tell them apart?
How do you tell them apart? This is Jimmy's Sal. This is Joe's Sal. So right there, the same thing would happen with some of my uncles. We had 2 Sonnies. So one of them was identified by his wife, and the other one was identified as Brother Sonny. So you had Brother Sonny and Rosie Sonny. So, you do that kind of thing so you distinguish between the names. Well, that's what they do in the New Testament.
That's right.
They're separating those people out. You wouldn't know that unless you were an eyewitness and you knew these people personally.
That's right, yeah.
So when someone's telling them about it, if I'm telling you the story of Brother Sonny and I just call him Sonny, you say Rosie Sonny? I say, no, I have to say Brother Sonny, so you know which Sonny we're talking about. And it clarifies it for us. So that's an important part. Again, the New Testament does that really well.
Yes, it does. So then the third one, I'm sorry, we referred to it for a bit before, is embarrassing testimony.
Right.
And that one I was somewhat aware of, that the New Testament it doesn't clean the stories up.
It doesn't clean it at all. No.
I mean, I wouldn't write a story like that about myself.
Right, and even whether you're looking at Greek history, Roman history, or from any other part in the Middle East, that this was very clear that when someone was writing a testimony about themselves, they never included embarrassing testimony. So why did the disciples or the gospel writers include that the disciples were chastised, or that they lacked faith, or that they were not the ones who stood with Jesus but ran when Jesus was arrested and crucified, and that women who were not good could not really testify in a court of law by themselves? They had to have a man stand behind them and confirm their testimony. Why would the Gospels include those things unless they were true? Again, it talks about the veracity of the eyewitnesses. So they're including all these details that are true.
Yeah, I mean, assuming Mark's gospel is actually Peter's, why would you have the thing about denying?
Yeah.
When history tells us he's the leader of the church.
Right, and then becomes the leader of the church.
At
exactly.
Pentecost.
Yeah.
So, So that is there. And then the fourth thing, and we are running short on time here, the fourth thing is corroborating testimony. This strengthens the reliability of the testimony of the New Testament because it's corroborated by other people.
Yeah, I mean, if we wanted to, people say you're stacking the deck if we just use Christian writers from the 1st and 2nd century. So what we do is we use non-Christian writers to tell us this. And what I did was I assembled 12 things that you could build from various sources. There's something like, I think, 12 writers within the first 100 or so years after the resurrection that are non-Christians that write about the church, the death of Jesus, and so on, and the disciples. And basically, you could compile this list that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. He was buried, most likely in a private tomb. The disciples lost hope. Jesus' tomb was found empty. The disciples believed they saw Jesus alive, and their lives were transformed to the point where they were willing to die and face persecution because of it. They proclaimed Jesus as the risen Christ. This all took place in Jerusalem. And the message that centered on Jesus' death and resurrection, which was the message, actually took place also in Jerusalem. So they didn't go somewhere else to tell a story that went back there. Yeah. They changed the day of worship. In the Jewish sense, they changed the Sabbath, which was a very major thing for them to start to worship God on Sunday, which is still continued today. And the last two things are Jesus' brother James becomes converted. If you remember in the Gospels, he's not a follower, he's not a believer, but he becomes a believer later, and Saul of Tarsus becomes Paul, the apostle. So those 12 things are things that you can find in all of these writers. I didn't include the one that Thallus is the top one on my list because he's the earliest. He wrote in around 50 AD, and he was trying to explain away the darkness that covered the earth when Jesus was crucified, because that was a known event.
Okay.
And so Thallus is trying to say that the reason that it became dark was because there was a solar eclipse. The problem with that is that if you ask the question, when was Jesus crucified, it's the Passover. When is the Passover celebrated? It's when there's a full moon. So when you have a full moon, you can't have a solar eclipse. Right. So it kind of like shoots that one in the head. But he's the first one that does that. Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus is probably the best known one. They're the ones that really we look at. Again, if I teach this in a class, we go through all of them.
Yes.
And spend all the time looking at what they wrote. But Josephus gives us perhaps one of the clearest ones, but so does Tacitus, where they talk about persecuting and things that happened when Claudius expelled the Jews out of Rome in 49 AD. So that's how we know when Paul was in Corinth, because he meets Priscilla and Aquila, who were expelled from Rome.
Right.
So we know it was at that time. So these things kind of dovetail for us.
Yeah.
Josephus mentions John the Baptist, James the Lord's brother, tells us Jesus was a wise and virtuous man, had many disciples. He was condemned by Pilate and crucified. So you have things written there that are handed down to us. Now, there's one thing we should remember about Josephus. It seemed at some point a Christian got hold of it and embellished some of the things that someone like Josephus, he would not have known.
So there are quotes of Josephus that aren't as accurate as they should be.
Right. And the way they found that out was through something that was written in another language, basically, and didn't have the embellishments in it.
Okay.
So it was, which you have so many different things when we.
So we don't need to be dishonest or intellectually dishonest to see the value of and the truth of Josephus's writing.
Right. Yeah, you don't.
Well, yeah, from the information you gave me, we could probably talk another 2.5 hours here.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to wind down now. If you have questions, you can email them to questions@notepadanswers.com. And if you'd like to have Ray come and do a presentation like this, if you'd like to have a discussion with him, again, that email address is good to use. And we hope to see you next time as we talk about now the reliability of the New Testament documents. We've talked about the content of the documents today,
Right.
but the documents themselves. So, how much can we count on the reliability of those documents, and comparing them to other ancient documents? And we'll look at that next time.